Okay, now let's talk about the STS, which is a service that is so important in AWS, which isn't going to allow us to assume roles across different accounts within the same accounts and also enables to identity federation. So let's get started. Let's get started. First, we define IAM roles within your accounts or a cross account that we want to assume. Then we define which principals can access this IAM role, and we'll use the STS service, which is a standard, which stands for like the security token service to retrieve credentials, and they are gonna be temporary. And this will allow us to impersonate the IAM role. We have access to like using the assume role API, and the credentials are going to be temporary, as I said, like the between 15 minutes to 12 hours. So the diagram, what does it look like? So our user wants to access a role. For example, it's within the same or another account. And so to do so, it's going to use the assume role API on STS. So STS will check the permission and make sure the setup is correct. And we'll go into the details how that look like, and then we'll get security credentials back. They are gonna be also temporary, and these security credentials will allow us to access the target role. So in which situation would we want to assume a role using STS? So, well, first of all, if you want to provide access to an IAM user in this account, or that you want that you own or your own accounts to another resource, or maybe like that you want to provide an IAM access users in other accounts, third parties access to your account as well. Maybe you want to also help your AWS services to what to do what they need, so like they're using service roles. And then maybe we also want to perform identity federations, and we'll have a deep dive onto identity federation in this course because you need to know them all. So now for STS, there's this feature which allow us to revoke active sessions and credentials for a role. So this is very simple. You just need to change the policy and a time statement, or use the AWS revoke older sessions managed policy, and that's perfect. And so using this time condition, you are able to say, okay, this role cannot be used anymore, and so that gives you an extra level of security. I remember when we use STS, when we assume a role for it, be a user and application or a service, we give up our original permissions and we take the permission assigned to the role. And so we already had a discussion so as to whether we should use a role or a resource-based policy, but just as a slight reminder here. Okay, so here is a deep dive in a little bit on providing access to an IAM user in your or another AWS account that you own. So this is within your circle of trust. In which case we can, for example, create a role in account A for A star. It could be another account that you own. Okay, so to terminate EC2 instances. And so this is very important that this is all the accounts that you own, because in the next slide we'll see we'll see about the accounts we don't own, third parties accounts. So in this case, the users will assume a role, and the benefits of that is that we need to explicitly grant our users permission to assume the role to perform the termination of the EC2 instance action. So we can also force the users to switch to that role using the management console or the CLI and the assume role API. And so the idea is that we have an extra level of security here. We can also add multi-factor authentication protection to the role so that only users who are assigned using MFA can assume the role. So what this gives us as well is list privilege and and auditing using CloudTrail. So by using this intermediary step to terminate EC2 instances, we have a lot of extra security added to it, and that is very common pattern in AWS, something that a solution architect should be thinking all about. Okay, but what does it look like in practice where we have STS account access? So again, just a reminder, but something you already have seen before probably. So we have a production account within S3 bucket and a development account. And with two groups of users, for example, testers and developers, and we want to provide developers access to the S3 bucket production app. So the first thing we do is that the production account, the admin will create a role that grants the development account read or write access to the production app bucket. So this role will allow us to access the S3 bucket. Then in the development account, we are granting the members of the developer group access to assume this update app role. So what happens then, the users of that group, the developers group only, can access or request access to the role using the STS API. And STS API, STS will return here the temporary credential, role for the temporary credential, and using these credentials, the users can access the S3 bucket. And using the role credentials, so very simple. So it's very simple. Again, just as a revision, but I want to make it dead clear that how STS works, because it gets a little more complicated right now, and this is probably something new for you, but very important to know for the professional solutions architect exam. So now, in case you want to provide access to AWS accounts owned by third parties, so there's going to be an extra thing called the external ID. So this is our text that we are actually seeing, but we have a diagram later. So then I have a diagram. So this is the zone of trust. And the zone of trust is all the accounts and the organization that you own. And the outside of the zone of trust is going to be the third party's account. For example, you work with a partner and they provide you a service, and you want to give, let's say like a consulting company, and you want to give that consulting company access to your accounts. They are outside of your zone of trust. They are not directly in your organization. And so you can use IAM Access Analyzer to find out which resources in your accounts are outside of your zone of trust. Okay, so which resources, for example, your S3 bucket. For example, your S3 bucket are going to be granted to third parties, and if you want to grant access to a third party to some of your resources, you can get something called like third party AWS account ID, which is a very obvious. And the most important thing here is you define an external ID, and this external ID is a secret between you and the third party, and you have to define it. And this is because if you give access to the third party to a role in your accounts, you want to make sure that only that third party has access to this role. So this is to uniquely associate the role between you and the third party, and it must be provided when defining the trust and when assuming the role, and we'll see why. And it must be chosen by the third party. You define the permission in the IAM policy and you are good to go. So now let's have a look at a bit more details to make it a bit more clear about why this external ID is so important. Why this external is so important? And this is called the confused deputy. Okay, so this is a diagram directly coming from the documentation, and so we see here is that we have your AWS account on the left hand side, and we have third party in the middle, and we have another AWS account on the right hand side. Okay, and the account on the right hand side that we don't own is going to try to attack us on the left hand side, and to attack us it's going to be using the account in the middle. So let's see what happens when you don't use the external ID, and how this attack is possible, and what happens when we have the external ID, and how this prevents the attack. So in the first case, this account right here has created an example role right here, and this example role is going to be able to assumed by the middle account. So we are saying, okay, here is this ARN of this example role, and you are able to assume this role and access some of our resources within our accounts using this role. So this is everything we have seen so far. And then the other account is going to try to attack us. So it's going to say, hey, to the middle account, hey, I have a role for you, and this role is going to allow you to access stuff in my account. But instead of providing a role in their account, they provide the exact same AWS one example role ARN to the middle account. So this one doesn't know, it can't verify whether this role belongs to the account on the left or on the right. So it's going to be assuming the role is assuming that role, and by assuming that role, instead of assuming the role on the right hand side account, it's going to assume roles on the left hand side account, and without knowing it. And so therefore it's going to think that it's going to be performing action on the right hand side account, but actually it performs actions on the left hand side account. And this is called the confused deputy. Because the account in the middle is confused, it thinks like it's going to operate on the right hand side account, but it actually operates on the left hand side account. And so this is why AWS defined this external ID thing. So let's see how this protects against this attack. And this is an exam question, so this is why I'm going to deep into this. So we have now the same setup, but this time we also define an external ID to assume this role. And this external ID is something secret that is shared between your account and the account in the middle. So we are saying, okay, here is the ARN of the account. You should assume a role of that you should assume. But when you do assume this ARN, you need to pass in the external ID that we have defined together. And so as such, okay, it's able to access the role because we both know the secrets. Okay, when we look at the other AWS account on the right hand side, which is trying to attack us, it's going to try to attack us again, and this role on the left hand side, but it does not know the external ID. So it's going to give another external ID to the account in the middle. And this time, by providing the wrong external ID, this is going to be preventing the account in the middle to access our AWS account because the external ID is not matching. And therefore, we have added an we have added an extra level of security here. So bottom line is, you don't need to know exactly all the steps, but I want to show you exactly how that works, and not just like tell you like using the external ID prevents this kind of attack. So bottom line is still, if you are using third-party accounts and they need to get access to your AWS accounts, and you need to secure that, the answer is to use the STS Assume Role API, but also to define an external ID. And this hopefully a description of how this works helps you also. Okay, so finally to conclude with STS, there's a few important API you need to know. The assume role is the most basic one, which is to access a role within your account or across account. Assume role with SAML, which is to get credential when we are federated with SAML. Assume role with web identity, which we are using an IDP, identity provider. And so that includes like Amazon Cognito, login with Amazon, Facebook, Google, or any OpenID Connect compatible identity provider IDP. And so we'll be seeing this in the detail in the federation section. And overall, just so you know, right now AWS does not recommend to use the AWS Assume role with web identity API anymore. It recommends to like they use the Cognito instead. Then we have get session token, which is used for MFA multi-factor authentication. So when we log using MFA to get the credentials back, or get federation token, which is usually to get credentials, temporary credentials when we have a federation using a proxy app. For example, when we have something that distributes tokens within a corporate network. Okay, so at a high level, these are the important APIs you need to know. The most important ones are going to be the first four, and I don't think the fifth one, it get federation token, is going to be in the exam, but it's still for me good to tell you that what it is. Okay, so that's it. I will see you in the next lecture for some more of the identity federation information. Thank you. Have a great day.